My dad was like, you cannot do anthropology. Like, please do something where you make $1, where you can like do something.
Where'd your interest in research come from? Is that something that you picked up and learned about during school, or did it start before that?
I remember like my senior year being like, well, shit, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to make $1? How am I going to support myself? It was a really tough time for me because my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She lasted about 1.5 years, 2 years from that diagnosis, 22, 23. And I had this like life-altering event. I was laid off with only senior directors and vice presidents. And so they laid off a couple dozen of us all at once. Do not let others define you. Continue to believe in yourself and continue to define who you are.
Getting laid off is a reality that many in tech have faced, but how you handle it can define your next chapter. Jessica Sommer opens up about the emotional and professional challenges of job loss and how she turned uncertainty into opportunity. From navigating layoffs and leadership shifts to balancing career growth and personal challenges, Jessica's story is filled with hard-earned lessons that every UX professional needs to hear. She shares her perspective on resilience, adapting to change, and how to stay grounded in an industry that's constantly evolving. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. If you've ever faced a career setback or just wondered how to future-proof yourself in tech, this episode's for you. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Pixelated Path so you never miss an episode filled with real stories and actionable insights. Let's jump in. Where'd your interest in research come from? Is that something that you picked up and learned about during school or like in college, or did it start before that?
I think when I was looking to go to undergrad, I remember in high school, we talked a lot about like what is truth. And that had a lot of meaning for me. And also the concept of like hegemony of who has the power to tell the story becomes the truth. And so that actually really got me interested in research. And when I was looking at universities, I went to the University of Rochester. I actually early applied there. And they are, the number one small research institution in the United States. And so that is really where my love of research continued to blossom. And I could be interdisciplinary there. So I was able to do statistics as well as anthropology, a little bit of like right brain, a little bit of left brain. And I think that has like served me pretty well. But I think the concept of like, how do we define what truth is? Or how do we define what our version of that will be in this moment and what we use to do that and what is valid or not valid have always been very meaningful to me. And I think in the past couple of decades, it's been, more questionable about like what is truth. And that probably has made me put my heels in even deeper into like what is research and what does it mean to understand a concept and to always know that you have more opportunity to learn about that concept.
Tell tell me more about that, because going back to, so you're senior in high school, 17, 18, one of your classes, you're looking at, I don't know what class it was, like sometimes this happens in like history where you're going back and looking at like who wrote and what actually got
Yeah.
documented. And then as a 17, 18-year-old, then that jump to like anthropology and statistics, like did you have guidance, or how did, in retrospect, those were like great fields to study for the profession as it exists today?
Right.
Probably not
At the
when
time.
you made that decision.
Yeah. So my dad is an archaeologist. So we had anthropology in like a broad sense in the home. And while I studied culture anthropology, when I got to college, I was like, oh, I'm gonna do culture anthropology. I didn't have a scholarship. It's very expensive to go to university. And my dad was like, you cannot do anthropology. Like, please do something where you make $1, where you can like do something. And I was always very good at math and statistics. I was one of the only women in the statistics department. I was the only female TA at the time in statistics. And numbers have always come very naturally to me. So I did the double major. But my parents are always very much like, find what your passion and interests are and then, follow your heart kind of thing. And I acknowledge the privilege in that like I had that ability to have that conversation with my parents and actually to live that in some way. But so I remember when I first would go to like job interviews after college, you're like, why did you choose these paths? And I was like, well, my dad told me that he wouldn't pay for school if I didn't finish my statistics degree, like if I didn't do something else. And thank goodness, because like I use both of those very equally. And I think that when you only have that one perspective or that one side, it's not, I am a deep believer in making data and research very human centric in the sense that like it understands humans, both the soft side of humans and the hard side of humans. And that when you tell stories about research, and what like you're learning, you want to hit the heart really and like pull those heartstrings and then hit the head, right? So like here's the story about like, the socio psychological impact on whatever. And then here are the numbers that are actually going to like matter to people who are going to be making decisions down the road. They'll hopefully make more informed decisions if you have a story that like pulls at those heartstrings and gets them thinking in that way. And that's, I think, actually been like a root of a lot of most of the work that I've done in tech and in like the business in the traditional sense, sort of like landscaping.
I feel like from the outside, if you look at your undergrad and then straight into what you did afterwards, because you were doing like a lot of consulting around like innovation and research. Again, it feels like a pretty straight path and a pretty smooth transition from like your schooling to what you did. But that's sort of like from the perspective of what the discipline is today. Is that also true for you when you left school? Like, was it a pretty linear path straight out?
See, sort of. I remember like my senior year being like, well, shit, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to make a dollar? How am I going to support myself? And I took a practicum class, which was about going out into the community in Rochester and conducting, like, in essence, community research or participatory action research, which is when you go out into a community and learn from the community and then work with the community to facilitate tools and resources that enable them to articulate the problems that they have, come up with their own solutions, and then, you know, fund that in some way. And the professor who led that, Marianne McCabe, she really inspired me. And I was really able to see that she was, being hired by, Fortune 500 companies, as well as doing this teaching and also social justice work. And it really was meaningful to me. And I told her, I was like, I want to do what you do, I think, when I come out of school. And so she helped, refer me to a couple of firms. And the firm that I actually ended up joining was called the Geppetto Group. It was part of WPP at the time. And it was amazing. The woman that I worked for, was a Yale psychologist, Alexandra, and she taught me so, so much. And at that time, market research was the only thing that existed. There was no design research. Market research often lived within an ad agency. And so agencies would bid like, "Oh, we'll like learn about your people and then we'll, advertise them." And that was definitely what we were doing. But, when I graduated college, it was a really tough time for me because my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She lasted about a year and a half, 2 years from that diagnosis. And so I was in my first job, you know, living in Jersey City, New Jersey, working in Manhattan. Um, and I had this, I was, 22, 23, and I had this like life altering event.
Yeah.
Um, and the Geppetto Group was amazing to me. They allowed me to keep my job, right? Like they didn't pay me, but I was still employed. And they gave me like 5, 6 months off to spend time with my mother, which at the time, I mean, we hear that in the Valley now all the time, but in New York at that time, that was
I was
unheard of
I was
generosity.
just gonna say, very forward thinking.
I mean, so, so lucky. And like many people who have these life-changing events, they return to their, past work life or whatever, and they're like, "Well, gee, is this like how I wanna spend my time and what I wanna do?" And there were things that I absolutely loved about that job. I loved being in field. I love we specialized in children 0 to 24 and their parents, and that's who we were like our sweet spot was. So I learned about like omnibuses, big scale survey data. I also did a lot of like ethnography in home. We did like video diaries, all these kinds of like fun, interesting techniques that I had been like learning about but not practicing in school. I really got that like hands-on ground experience. Um, but I wanted to work in innovation. And so I ended up applying to a company called Left Blue Sky, which was part of Sapient Nitro. It was a think tank within Sapient Nitro, and it was a really small group. And we worked for Mars Chocolate, and we got to do like chocolate innovation. But the transition from that first job at Geppetto to that second job was very difficult for me. I felt like life is short, do something that like you find interesting, that you find meaningful. And innovation was that for me. I really felt that way. Like having deep empathy for people and leading innovation, facilitating those kinds of engagements brought me into flow states like very rapidly. And I just loved it. I felt really connected to other people and to ideas. But New York is a tough place, y'all. And I remember that job, like I would arrive at like 8:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I would leave at like 8 p.m. at night. And then I'd be getting emails from my like boss at like 2 a.m. And it was so hard. And also, it was a period in my life where, again, I had just lost my mother. The people in my life, because I had taken that 6 months off, I use like loosely, but like I was spending time with my, giving parental care, right? Which we never talk about. Everyone in my life was like, "Oh, get back to work. Go back right away." And so 2 weeks after
Mm,
she passed, because they had this assumption that, like, I had that, like, healing or, whatever, while that 6 months, well, I didn't, right? I actually at 20, 4, 25 was like, "No, like, I didn't have that healing." I had, like, a quarter life crisis of, like, "What's going on? What am I spending my time on? What is, my purpose and meaning in life?" And I did get a new job in industry that I'm very interested in, but it was not the right time. And so I ended up only lasting 3 or 4 months in that job. I was, like, working my ass off, and we all know the first 3 months any job is always, like, a bit of a grind anyway, right? But this, at the time in my life, I just, like, it was really hard. And so I ended up, quitting and was just like, "I need to do something else." And I did take a step back. I moved back in with my dad to save a little money for about 6 months, and I applied to Gallatin at NYU, which is a school of interdisciplinary study. And at Gallatin, I applied to focus on emerging adulthood and finance. And through my study there, I totally changed it and focused on how do you create experiences that enable thriving in others? And how does empathy lead to competitive advantage in organizations when they want to create communities that thrive, both within their employee base as well as in their customer base or whatever stakeholder base that you want to talk about? And that's what brought me out to the Bay Area, to Intuit. And I think, looking back on transitions now, I can talk about it. If you had met me, in that like year period between quitting that job, 6 months applying and then like being in grad school, it was some of the, I don't even wanna say scariest. I never felt like fear. I definitely felt like, "Oh, I'm comparing myself to my peers that all have different jobs, are already in grad school, or already know what they're doing." But what I really did was actually, like, double down on, like, research on myself and what matters to me, and so using those skills to, paint a picture of what I wanted to focus on. And again, I only applied to Gallatin. So I've been lucky that like every school I've applied to, I've gotten in that one time. And I think the reason is I actually really focus on what it means for me and how they work into my picture versus how I work into their picture, especially in that academic setting, I think is critical versus when you're in the corporate setting where you're like, they do care about who you are, but really they want to know like, what can you do for me? And how quickly can you do it? Right. But then, yeah, come into the Bay, which was a breath of fresh air and very different, uh, from the East Coast.
I want to go back a little bit because, like, you're still fairly young, like, just getting your career started. And to have something like that happen in your life is devastating for anyone. And then to take some time and then jump back into work, but realize you weren't ready. Like you said, like some of these things have been a bit more normalized today, but not understood and accepted at the time. But looking back, like what I heard is like you went back to work and you just weren't ready because you hadn't sort of gone through that process of taking care of yourself. What were the signs that you saw? Maybe like for someone today who going through something and I think people have the tendency to want to like work through it and like keep their minds busy and but what was going on with you that if like were signals maybe that was too early and and you weren't ready and you needed to spend more time on yourself?
I think listening to your body and knowing to listen to your body are easier said than done sometimes, especially when you're caught up in a wave of something, whatever that wave may be, right? When I started to feel, like, drained instead of excited and energized by the work, that's always a moment where I, like, pause and take a step back. When I'm mentoring folks, I ask that question all the time. I'm like, "How are you actually physically feeling?" Before we get into all the, office politics or, you know, technical questions that are kind of, fun to dig into or whatever, like, let's just breathe for a minute and, like, ask ourselves, like, "How do I physically feel?" Right? Now as a parent, right, I use that with my kids as well. When you start to see, like, a reaction of some sort, right? How do we acknowledge that and pause for a minute and think a little about like, where was that coming from? Okay, well, I responded this way because I felt like heightened in this sense and like it didn't align with expectation, whatever it may be, right? But it also may be like, hey, like I didn't realize I was gonna have to have like all this parental care that I was supposed to be that I'm gonna need to do in addition to like having, you know, children under 10, X number of children under 10, whatever. Like I'm now at the stage in my life where like even more is being demanded of me. And my husband and I, we always say, like, it doesn't get easier. We get better at solving the problems and working through it. And I think that's very true. I also, this is a bit of a side tangent, but like, I deeply believe in intergenerational working, living, and community living, like community building. There's so much that we can learn from other generations if we just have the patience to actually listen and then the time to reflect with them. I think like we can get a lot out of that. I also just want to plug like therapy is wonderful. Therapy or with any personal exploration lever that you may have and, available to you, specifically around certain topics at different times in your lives, right? I know many people who have been in therapy for a very long time and love it and have their person. I love that. I personally believe that like there are certain situations in your life that like you need to engage and get support on and get those tools, resources, whatever. Have that space to discuss it and explore it with another person to actually be able to work through it. I think the hardest thing whenever you're doing transitions of any kind, or when you have these big life changes, or even on a day to day basis, is like continuing to believe in yourself. And so when I do a lot of mentoring, it's like just reminding people, like, okay, well, I hear that, like, person X, attacked you or like, defended you or whatever it was, like offended you in some way, right? Like, does that matter? Do you still believe in you? Right? Do you see other people still believing in you? Right? How are you showing up in that moment? And I think it's something that's like a lifelong quest, I guess, of like we all have imposter syndrome at times, right? And like continuing to believe in yourself so that you can like push forward in that moment is hard. I'm sure it also sounds like very American. Like believe in yourself. You are but I actually think it's harder to do. Everyone like listen, Americans, they all just are like their, confidence is off the charts. And I don't think that's true at all. I think it's very much like we live in a society that, promotes and supports people who believe in themselves. So yeah, something that I'm continuing to work on, that everyone I hope continues to work on for themselves.
Question that you asked earlier of like, how are you feeling physically is a really interesting one. I suspect most people out there have never been in a one on one with their manager where people will say, how are you doing? But to be very intentional about how are you physically feeling and then expect like just saying it, like you expect like an answer to that. That's really interesting. What are some like what are some answers to that that you've heard that start to be yellow or red flags that someone is like not in the right place?
Like
What does that look
rambling,
like? Okay.
like they just can't like take a breath, right? There's so much that, there's so many demands and they feel so responsible for those demands and needs and they care, which I love. I hire, you want to hire people because they believe, right? And it's not always that they're doubting themselves. It's just like it can be the overwhelm, like, oh my God, there's so much. And so I look for those cues of like right. And then I try to facilitate that conversation to like, okay, so I hear that like this is the problem. Let's, I can provide, following air coverage or like solutions in the following way and so forth. Not sleeping. People that aren't sleeping, that they're like struggling, they're having there. I ask people, when was the last time you went outside? I'm really big on like one-on-one walks, even if they're remote, like we can be on screens or we can just go out and like be on headsets and at least you're out like in nature and like breathing a little bit and walking and hopefully like, especially, during pandemic and with hybrid work, it's like how much time does one spend in front of the screen? How many
Mhm.
lights do I get to stare at all day? It's so fun. Have like, oh, I didn't eat, I skipped lunch today. Let's stop. Please go get a snack. Nothing here is as urgent as like you like staying hydrated, staying well, being rested, right? Or that of your like immediate family that you are, like, responsible for, right? Work doesn't reward that, right? Work doesn't reward the fact that I like left a meeting 5 minutes early so that I could use the bathroom and have lunch before an interview, right? Or like whatever it is, right? They reward like, the end ROI. I also think like physical fitness in whatever shape that means for you When I was at Bell, we did a couple of things. One was we actually started every team meeting with a meditation that I would lead. You'll see here on my back desk, I have like a little meditation bowl and stuff.
I just want to point out that I think for someone who doesn't know you and hearing all this, it's very easy to say, like, yeah, that sounds great on a podcast, but otherwise, bullshit. Like, you don't actually do all that stuff. You actually do. Like, the time that I've spent working with you, aside
Yeah.
from being excellent at the research work, this is a big part of, like, what it is like working with you, and I think that's so amazing.
That's so sweet
I
of you to say. I feel, being in New York, I couldn't in the early days, I don't think those kind of like moments or interventions would have been like acceptable socially. Coming to the Bay Area and to Silicon Valley, where like there's this understanding and belief that ideas are power more than anything else, I think. That's my belief. That's what the vibe I get here. One of the reasons I intentionally came to the Bay and to Intuit was because I wanted to lean into sort of like the bleeding edge of design thinking, which, at the time was frothy, right? It was brand new when I came out in 2012. So 2010, 2009, right? 209, 2009. And being it into it, my job was to create empathic experiences that connected the 30,000 employees to our customers and to each other. So that like cross functionality would happen more fluidly. And to me, again, the root of all that is empathy. And so it was really fun. I did a lot of like physical space design that intentionally created like moments for people to like bump into each other, or visual art installations that got you thinking about research, empathy, ideas, custom, whatever, in like a new way because it was like a tactical, visceral experience, right? So that visceralness triggers mirror neurons in our brain, right? And enables us to remember things and feel things more, right? So that science side of it, adding that was very accepted here in the Bay. And it was very exciting. And I remember those 4 years at Intuit, like Capital One came to look at us and then they opened their lab in SF. And like all these Disney and like all these different companies were like, learning from each other in the design thinking phase is very exciting. Um, as a researcher, facilitation is a very important, bow or quiver in my bow or whatever that expression is, right? Like facilitating leadership and executives who are trained to be stoic and lean back from emotions, never react, right? Like be that political creature. You learn a lot about a company when you see, can you get those executives to roll a ball on their foot, you know, in front of 60 other executives? Like, do they do it or not? And you can see. And I'll tell you, sometimes the folks that like lean back and don't want to participate, they're not there the next year. To get outside your own comfort zone, how are you going to think outside the box and come up with all the different ways of innovation that we need to like move something forward, right? And to scale. I have faced, I think discrimination is too hard of a word. So but I'm not sure what else to use. Like judgment, that's a better word. I have faced judgment because some of my methodologies, like the ones I've been sharing, feel fluffy to other people, which is why I bring up the science. I'm like, hey, well, the mirror neurons and like your breathing technique actually, like how your physicality feels affects how you're able to think and, the ideas that you come up with, etc. And now I think it's much more accepted, these kinds of practices. There's still like a bit of a old guard, new guard, bullshit that's always happening. But I don't think in the Bay Area these techniques are that strange. But I would also be curious, given just like, the waves of layoffs in tech and stuff and how things are transitioning and how we're moving more towards like keeping great talent and giving them an AI to like supercharge them and make them superhuman. Like, what are we expecting of people? And with these new expectations, what additional tools are you giving them to allow them to reach to that humanness of themselves? Right. I know that even sounds like fluffy to say like the humanness of oneself, like we are human. We're not yet like droids. Maybe soon we'll have, bells and whistles attached to us. But like this is where we are today. I don't want to lose that.
Yeah. I wonder how we've talked a lot about, like, self-care and mental health. I wonder how much of that landscape is changing for people that work in tech right now of everything going on. There are layoffs happening at many, many companies. We just saw both Dropbox and Miro this week announce layoffs, and many people that I know in my own network, and I'm sure people that you know also were impacted by that. AI is a big unknown with so many jobs being automated and companies flattening their orgs. Just did a earnings call where Sundar said 25% of the code written at Google is written by AI. When I was at Google, they announced this was about a year and a half ago, and they announced the first layoff that Google had ever done in the history of the company. And it was more than 10,000 people across the company. But the only people at the company that knew were those in the US. Outside of the US, the decision had already been made. They didn't know who, and they didn't know when they would be told. And the anxiety that that created was insane. And so
Yeah.
what does that do to we talk a lot about, like, things like psychological safety in tech, and, Google's well known for studies that they've done on, what that does to high performing teams. Like, what does that do to those sorts of things?
When you tell that story, the first thing that comes to mind for me is US first mindset versus a global first mindset. And most companies that I have worked for, especially those that are like in a scaling or growth mode, are often going from like a US only lens to a global lens. And they do that through, a variety of levers, acquisitions, whatever, like things happen. How American of us, again. I dare to say, right? Like, it doesn't surprise me in the least. Most of the executives are in the United States, and so they're making these decisions for people in other countries. And, US first mindset. I think it's very
Hmm.
sad. But to pivot on that to a more optimistic lens, which I do try to do, I'm actually quite excited about some of the layoffs. I know that layoffs are, as someone who's been laid off, as someone who has done layoffs, they are uncomfortable in the moment, and I believe a lot of positivity can come from them in the end. I believe positivity for the business that's doing the layoffs because hopefully they're, like, opening up capital to, like, put, to fund new veins. I've seen a lot of companies who lay people off and rehire them back into another role that, is tangential or somehow related. But with AI and with the exponential growth of that curve of that learning, I'm really excited about, like, solopreneurship and what we're really gonna see. Right now I'm working, in the climate migration space and focusing on, I don't wanna give too much away, like, scenario-based AIs with agents. I'll just leave it, like, open like that. There are so many interesting, hard problems that we have people with these unique skill sets that can dig into them, that are tired of the political rigmarole, that are tired of someone who they don't know telling 10,000 people that they're laid off and, like, not even thinking, like, not even considering the, like, communication path of that, right? Like, these things that feel like no-brainers, they're over it, right? How might we as a society continue to activate the agency of these folks and give them resources, get them excited about working on these really hard problems that we need solutions to, that some of these big companies are not yet tackling, right? Or that they tackle in a certain way, or that they're limited, right? There are so many benefits to startups and to being smaller companies, right? To being able to disrupt in different ways and move fast. All those like cliches of the early knots about like, move fast and break. There is truth to that. There's a reason that it worked. We don't need to like throw it all out just because like we're on this next exciting new wave, right? Like what can we still leverage from that? But to anyone who's more new in their career, I just wanted to talk about like when people do get laid off, some thoughts on that, if that's all right. What we see kids being taught in elementary school now, right, is and that, all adults are continuing to always work on is how do we not react in that moment to that change, but how do we like respond to that change in a way that's actually healthy, beneficial for us in the long term, right? You know, it can be hard to feel that way in the moments. I go back to my comments of pause and breathe, right? I see no reason you can't, like, take a moment and, like, step away from something and return to it, or take half a day off because, like, it's too much mental drain on you. Those things are all appropriate. Um, everyone, I mean, especially in the Bay and in, design community, people are always there to advocate for you and help like lift up the community on the whole. We've seen so much of that. It's so wonderful. Um, I know people are expressing it's like difficult to find a job or that like it just takes longer. I think that's because the companies still don't know which direction they're going yet. They've done a lever to like cut something and like hoard resource and then figure out where they're going to put that resource or how and when they're going to roll out those resources sometimes takes more time. We see a lot right now about how AI is not living up to its expectation in some ways, especially in within organizations. As someone who has built multiple systems that look at data within organizations and provide like end-to-end insights, I think that the repurposing of resources to better leverage what we do know today and how do we innovate off that still remains a critical hurdle that we're that most organizations are still struggling to like make 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 perfect perhaps in some way. But I just
I
want
want
to
to
say like don't be afraid of a layoff. You know, it's people take it so personally because like, you know, oh my gosh, like they just laid me off. Well, lift your lens for a moment and see like, okay, well, here's where I am. Here's where the organization is in the whole. Here's why they're doing it in theory. Yes, I can be upset that like this is affecting my life and that I worry, will I be able to feed, my family, keep a roof over my head, all those things. But again, believing in myself and, always going back to that, what are my unique skills? How can I get back out there again? And what does that look like for me? I can make that story whatever I want it to be, right? The fact that someone laid me off does not define me and does not define my story in any way, shape, or form. Layoffs are often a story about the company doing the layoff, not about the people getting laid off.
I want to talk a little bit about where these thoughts and this view is coming from for you because it's easy to hear this and say, well, it's easier said than done. Have you been laid off before?
Yeah, so I was laid off at Bill. I joined Bill and I was there for just over a year. And in that time, I hired 30 people, built a research practice from nothing, did segmentation, job to be done segmentation, Chris. I love it. All these, wonderful, fun things, led multiple multi day strategy workshops, partnered with business intelligence, data, insights, all these fascinating, wonderful things. But sitting with those executives in those strategy meetings and learning where they were at and what was going on, I have my own questions and like believes in that. When the CEO decides to change out 80% of his executive team in 1 year, changes will happen. Right. So that was my situation, which was like, okay, I've been here for about a year. So we have a new, we have, 8 new executive team members. And in their own times, each one is the executive team has to gel. That takes time. I've never seen that done in less than 3 months. It takes time. And then the rollout of those decisions and what that looks like, it takes time. And so I was laid off along with I was a senior, director, and I was laid off with only senior directors and vice presidents. And so they laid off a couple dozen of us all at once, sort of to clean that level of management out so that the new executives could bring in people that they wanted or, use those resources however. They also chose to basically fold all of design into product. There was no longer like my manager, my VP that I was reporting into in design, he was laid off as well. And so all of that reported into product. And then all of research ended up reporting into strategy, which was actually a suggestion that I had made like my third month there. And so I was happy to see that that was a change, whether or not I was working. I was like, thrilled. That's a great way to do research, right? I am blessed enough that at that time I had been working for 18 years straight. My husband was employed and had insurance. And so we had medical. We had a little bit of like a nest egg to fall back on. And so I decided to take like a sabbatical, a break. And so I've had about a year, 2 years off now, and I'm now starting my own thing I'm really loving. And I want to acknowledge that not everyone has the privilege to take that time off. For me, I've never taken so much time off in my life, and I've absolutely loved it. I encourage everyone, if you have the possibility, even to take like a month or 2 months off. Again, self reflection, self growth, excellent time to check your own pulse. I also want to tell a story about layoffs where, so I moved out to the Bay Area from New York area, and it was my second week on the job. And I had my first time managing. I had a team of 12, half were in San Diego, half were in Mountain View. And I was told that I was going to be laying someone off, someone I had only ever met once. I had been managing for 2 weeks. And it was one of the scariest moments in my career at that time. I'd never managed before, I'd never laid off before. I learned so much about layoffs in that process. This was at Intuit at the time. They had a really good team to sort of like prep you for layoffs to do it. The learning of what goes into a layoff, I think, helped me understand so much greater and not take it personally. And then also gave me the ability to explain to others based on what I knew legally was going on, why we behaved in a certain way. I still get friends who call and are like, "Oh my god, did you hear about this layoff?" Where they were like, some, robot called them and laid them off or something like that, or, they do like group layoffs and things like that. And, my response to anyone who ever gets laid off is never sign right away. Never. Just wait. Do your own due diligence. Speak to people that you care about. Give yourself a week. If you're over 65, remember that you have additional legal rights and you can always come back and ask for more and you have more time. But also, again, like, do not let others define you. Continue to believe in yourself and continue to define who you are, right? Life, y we are not always just the same person. We continue to grow and transition. And so, why I can understand that, like, we have fear around external change, right? But we also have fear around our own internal change, and that's even harder than the external change sometimes, the intersection of those 2. And so again, just like the more comfortable you can get with the change, if you could say to yourself, every time something changes, even if we hate it, if we really don't like it, what opportunity does this create for me? What can I do now that I have never been able to do before because now I don't have this responsibility, right? Or this opportunity is closed. Cool. I can go and do this other opportunity that I was thinking about before. I turned 40 this year, and I feel this was like another sort of like moment of great like transitional change for me in the sense of what do I want to do with my business? What is the expertise I have? The fact that I can write on a resume like 20 plus years of something now, I'm like, well, shit, like that is a lot, right? Like I don't have to just keep going on that. I can like, my trajectory can change a little bit, right? Like, what are the strengths that I love to work on and double down on? And how might I apply that elsewhere in different industry? And I think it's scary. I mean, I know it's scary to do that. I've done that. But it also made me feel good like, oh, like I do have these additional skills, etc. And I can use them in new ways. The last thing I will just say is like being cautiously optimistic, I find is a very good way to live.
I mean, the perspective that you have on what this moment meant for you and what it's allowed you to do, I think is amazing and incredibly positive. I think having been through similar moments, that as scary as it may be, once you're on the other side, you realize it was all for the better. And I wonder how much of that has come to you with the benefit of just like time to process and think back. Like in the first few moments, like what was your process like early on? Like, did your brain immediately jump there, or like within the first hour of getting the notice and bill that you and a group of others were being laid off, like everything you just described, like was that your mindset, or did it take you a little while to get there?
I think I felt like I literally felt a weight lifted. Like I felt lighter. I remember physically feeling that way. And again, as someone who actively tries to pay attention to like how I'm physically, I remember feeling that way. And I remember feeling that way because we were at a pivotal point where like with multiple projects we're like, we were hitting hurdles. And of course the reason we were hitting hurdles is because the resources weren't being provided because the company was in a transitional moment. But we weren't aware of that at the time, right? Because we didn't know the layoff was coming, right? So at first I was like, "Oh, I don't have to deal with that nonsense anymore." Right? Like what a blessing. And my husband at the time was just getting into a new startup. So he had sold his previous business and had taken a year off. And I remember while he was off, I was like, I wish we were off together at the same time. Like, what a cool blessing that would have been to have happen. But he had just started something new. And so I immediately was like, oh, now I can take the year off and like take a breather and it's going to be okay. And so I kind of felt a little, I just remember the emotion I don't know, I can't put a word to, but I remember like feeling physically lighter. And then I remember talking to my directs and being like, on the back end, because they close all down your operation. But we all know how to reach each other. And really being quite calm. Like they were panicked. They were like, like, you were our cover, you were, our North Star. Like, what are we doing without, And I'm like, it's gonna be okay. Right? Like nothing actually is changing. You know who your allies are, like lean into that. And the reason they're doing this because all the executive team changed and now they're coming in. This is very normal, right? That's always been a bit of my belief ever since learning about layoffs. I have gotten my hand slapped at time at Dropbox when layoffs occurred. And after layoffs occurred, my question was like, cool, like this has happened. Not cool, but like this occurred. What now? The act of asking what now was deemed aggressive for the Dropbox culture. And I remember receiving feedback being like, how could you ask such an insensitive question? Like, what's happening next related to the following metrics that we needed to hit, right? And I was like, I appreciate your feedback. That's the question that everyone's going to be asking next week. Right? So like let's get it addressed now. And perhaps that's just like my mindset of like a bit of a pragmatist, right? It's like, you know, we still have to meet these goals. That hasn't changed. That's not changing. What does that, what does this new resource allocation mean and how do we go? That doesn't mean that I don't have empathy and sympathy for people that have been laid off, right? As someone who has gone through it myself. I also believe that like many taboo topics like money, weight loss, your job layoff, how much you make. These are all topics people like society has made taboo and told us to not talk about. And because we don't talk about them, they become even more emotional. We never understand them, right? We don't know how to address them when they do arise, these situations in our lives. It's like when women don't know how to negotiate for certain salaries. And I'm thrilled to see that like now salary transparency is more prevalent. But I think it's that I've gotten away from myself here, but it's that idea that it will be okay. And I think just, saying that doesn't always, you don't always feel that. But to your point, if you experience things being like, I'm still going to be okay. I'm still going to believe in myself. I have these skills. I will come through this better in a long run. And I believe in myself and my ability to make it through this. That's the string that I keep wanting to tug on and encourage others to tug as well.
I think this like approach to difficult situations and the resilience and positive outlook that you show is really important. Sort of like started early in your career and has kind of showed up again and again and again. Hold on. What? No. My computer is telling me I need to force
What's
quit
wrong?
Chrome. I don't want to do that.
No, don't force quit Chrome.
Oh boy.
It still
Stop.
says it's recording on my side.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to try to power through it. Hopefully this still works. Okay. Sorry. Let me start
Okay.
over.
No worries.
So
Panic.
oh my God. Okay. I'm just going to, you know how like your computer says you want to update? Do you
Update
want to update right now?
Safari.
And you're like right in the middle of something. So you
No,
just
I
kind of like
don't.
it in the corner and you're like, can I just ignore this for like 10 more minutes?
Until it keeps pinging you.
Yeah. Okay. Um, so this like resilience and like positive outlook that you have on situations like this, it started earlier in your career and continues to show up. I think it's so important for helping you get through the situations that you've been in. One thing that we haven't even touched on is you were working as a senior leader in a large tech company, demanding work environment. The pandemic hits, and then on top of that, you have a child all at
And a nightmare.
once. Like how did you get through that one?
Yeah. Tough one. So my son was born April 2020. We were the first, he was a scheduled C-section, and I was the first Stanford patient that was required to be COVID tested before my surgery. And I remember the nurses being like, hallelujah, they're finally doing this. We don't want to get sick. Right. I remember I was like, oh, thank God. But yeah, it was a really tricky time. At that time, I was working for a VP, product VP, brilliant person, and she had given birth. And she had returned to the office 1 week after giving birth. And I remember saying to her, she was on a bunch of meds. She had a really rough birth, and I remember saying to her, like, "What are you doing here? Go home. Like, are you crazy?" I was like, "What kind of example are you setting for the rest of us women? Am I expected to be here 1 week after I have given birth? Because it ain't gonna happen." Right? And like here in California and with that company, we get 6 months paid leave. So why, what example are you setting? And the response was given was like, "Well, I'm a VP and you wouldn't understand." And I still hold that with me, and I was very upset by that because I don't believe that your level in organization determines how much time you get to care for yourself or your child. And so that was a difficult one. Also, one more anecdote, which is right after I announced that I was pregnant at work, colleague came to me and she worked in my department but wasn't, reporting to me or anything. And she said to me, "My husband and I really want to have a child. Can I have a child while I'm here?" And I still recall this conversation and think about it because my response to her was, "Are you asking permission if you can have a baby to me?" I was like, "That's wild. Like, think about that. Like, that's how important your job is to you, that, like, you feel you need permission from your job to have a baby. Wild." That was impetus for me to just really start talking more about, like, being pregnant in the corporate world and what that looks like. And I have been pregnant twice. I was pregnant while I was at Amazon, and I was pregnant, while I was at Dropbox. And while I was pregnant during the pandemic, it was just a really hard time. There was a really hard push right before I went on leave. And I ended up having to go on leave a little early just due to medical, issues. And then I gave birth, very joyous. Noah is well and fine. He's now 4. And but we're, you know, secluded at home. We're not like leaving the house. And then here in California, there were the wildfires and there was orange skies. And I just remember feeling like the world is ending and like, what are we doing here? Having children has given me the perspective that not everything is so serious at work, that, we can lean back. There are more important things that we should be thinking about. I also have so much more empathy for like, not even empathy, but like strictness for keeping to like the workday, right? Like I have to go when someone's like, I have to go do childcare, like they actually mean it, right? They have to, they need that time to go. I recall seeing, you'll look at resumes and you'll see like, oh, someone has like a gap of like a couple years for like childcare and they come back and like, oh, do you even know what's going on in the workforce anymore? Like, who are you? And it makes me sick. Right? It's like these are incredibly talented people who, like, understood that there is value in, like, caring for another human, and they're doing that. But I do also feel very grateful for being in the Bay Area and working for tech while I went through those pregnancies, because I have friends all across the country who received no time off from work, like, none of the resources and benefits that I had. And even with the resources and benefits I had, we all have struggles with kids at different times, the struggles keep changing. And so I just want to applaud every woman or parent, rather, I should say, in the workforce who openly talks about being a parent in the workforce and what that means and how that looks like without the mentorship and ability to talk to other people who have children younger and older and understand like what am I going to do when they hit this grade and like what does that look like and how did you approach it, right? Like it really has given me a lot of hope and also resources. And so I just want to encourage everyone, if you are a parent, to talk about that. Don't hide that as part of, who you are and your identity in the workplace.
I do want to say, because I think for people who are outside of Bay Area tech looking in, can be a lot of like you hear on the surface and maybe myths, and some of it's true. But the manager that you had, and I was there, but I won't name names.
You've given too
The
much away already.
That's okay. The example that she said, and then the response she had to your situation, I just want to call out how completely unacceptable that was. Even like,
Yeah.
even for Dropbox culture, like this was not a Dropbox thing. This was counterculture to how Dropbox worked and many other companies that I've been at. And so I just want to point out, because I think it's unfortunate that there are probably people out there who have had similar experiences and similar unacceptable behavior from managers. But outside looking in, because area tech can feel competitive and cutthroat and all these things. But I just want to point out that that is absolutely not the norm. And I think we're fortunate for that. But that was a really difficult situation.
Yeah, I don't think coming in to work sitting on a donut and taking painkillers so that you can participate in like a brainstorming session is an appropriate behavior. I don't care if you're like the CEO of a company and that's what you're doing. Nothing, I worry about that like all, whether there's a work life separation or balance, I just feel that's not like a wellness thing, right? One of the reasons I left a previous role was because when I was pregnant, I was told that like my promo case was going to be submitted. And I prepared all this stuff. I worked with my manager on that. And when I returned to work, I asked like where that had gone. And I was told that like, oh, that was all like this person had realized like it wasn't ready. And that's fine. But instead of communicating any of that to me in a honest way, they chose to not say anything for fear because I was pregnant. And so I think there's this also training from an HR perspective that needs to be done around how do you help your employees do family planning and what does family planning mean in relationship to the work that we do? And how does our company support families and singles and couples and dog parent, whatever it is, whoever you are? How do we support everyone? But especially in how we plan for our own futures, how do companies support that? Because again, the most expensive cost is finding the right person and getting that button seat, right? Like that's the most expensive thing. If we want to maintain that person as long as possible for cost savings, right? And to have like, good culture. In order to do that, you really need to give your management teams more resources than just like MBA programs, right? It really needs to be more focused on organizational psychology, relationship building, communication skills and styles, things of that nature. And I think we do see more of that, but I'm curious to see how that all evolves given that like HR departments are being cut pretty deep with this mindset that like, oh, AIs, we can just build fun little bots to replace our AI, our HR people because it's all legal, right? Like, no, right? Like, how do you keep it human? And I just want to say, like, Dropbox, one of the reasons I went there, it's one of the most human centric companies I've ever worked for, right? Super customer centric, super super, super, super employee centric, right? They care. So yeah, I think sorry, I don't have a fun, like, way to wrap that sentence. I just think it's so hard, and I guess I would just encourage everyone to keep having those conversations, bring up those taboo topics, create safe spaces where these conversations can happen, and don't be afraid to be the person that asks that uncomfortable question, right? It's not until we figure out what that right question is, that we really start to learn and get the answers that we need. But again, spending time to think about, like, what is that question? That's I think the hard part.
To sort of close this out, I think there are legitimately professions out there that are not family friendly. And I think we're fortunate that working in tech, broadly speaking, is. But you do have people who are maybe at the beginning of their careers just getting into this profession that have these sort of questions like, I start a family or I have a young family, can I and grow in my career? What advice do you have for someone who's in that situation?
I think it's just, again, like, ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Don't be afraid to be honest with other people and say, "Hey, like, I'm thinking about X for myself. Can you help me explore it? Can we explore it together?" Right? And I think your manager, hopefully is a safe space for you to do that. They may not be, and so you may need to find other mentorship, and I always encourage, lateral exploration in that way, and not even just lateral all over the place. I think it also goes back to like intergenerational learning, right? So ask those questions. If you're new to the workforce, try to find mentors that are of all different generational levels. People who have kids, people who have grandkids, people who are looking to retire, people who pivoted their career journey in different ways, right? Like go and learn from others and you will therefore learn about yourself in that process. I go back to that comment, the employee who came to me and asked like, "Oh, can I have a baby?" in essence. I ended up working with this person. I adore her, worked with her many times, given her more work. She's had a child since then. I was so When I look back on that, I think 2 things. One is I think I'm so proud of her for being brave enough to engage with me on that question. And I also reflect on myself and say, "What did I do to create that safe space where she thought she could come to me and talk to me about it when she hadn't been able to talk to anyone else about it? How can I continue to show up that way, even if it doesn't always rub people the right way? When I have in the past asked about parental leave or made comments about like how women are being treated in different ways in the workforce. And I will tell you, 90% of the direct teams that I have been on, I have been the only woman on that team. So I remind myself that while at times it can feel uncomfortable, it is important that I keep showing up and expressing these concerns and be proactive in trying to find solutions. You don't want to just be a squeaky wheel. You want to help be part of the solution as well. But more than anything, am I creating a safe environment where others are able to explore these things? Because if we don't have that safety, we're probably also not going to have a ton of safety in terms of like innovation, exploration, and what do we want to do next for our customers and for our employees and things like that. We don't quite get there. I think I'll close on this, which is to say you have to sort of make the space that you want it to be, right? Especially as you're coming new into the workforce, you feel like you have no power, right? You feel like the only thing you control is yourself. And so what can you do to show up for yourself every day and also to show up for the people that you care about and the things that you care about? It's hard to stay in that moment and do that, but the longer I'm in the workforce, the more I'm like, you really have to be present in each of those moments, especially in leadership, because the people that you're engaging with need that presence from you in order to be able to grow and move forward. Awesome. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me at Jessica A. Sommer, Sommer. And I will probably have maybe I'll reach back out to you guys because I have the solopreneurship stuff that I'm going to start kicking off in the new year and can share some more resources then as well. But always open to chat about anything research, anything about like being in tech, being a woman in tech, big data, all the good stuff.
And that wraps our conversation with Jessica Sommer. Her journey is a powerful reminder that career setbacks don't have to define us. They can be the catalyst for something new. From the reality of layoffs to the lessons no one teaches you in school, Jessica's insights on resilience and reinvention are the ones we can all learn from. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss out on more conversations about the highs, lows, and unexpected twists in UX careers. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.